Well, hello and welcome to Echoes, a Sumo History Podcast. I am Nathan of Honu Sumo in San Diego, California, and I am joined by my co-host and producer, JJ. And take it away, introduce yourself, JJ.
Yeah, so I am JJ Jones, resident ADD specialist, and started this beautiful podcast because my brain won't stop moving. And I'll popcorn back to you, Nathan.
All right, and I want to introduce our guest tonight, Jim McNaughton. Is that how you pronounce it, or did I butcher it?
You got it.
Okay.
Nope, you got it just right.
Excellent. So, who I wanted to talk to, and I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit more in a second, because when we were doing a bunch of research on different figures in sumo in the 30s, they're young men in the 30s, and one of the ones I was really looking at was a guy named Bud Mukaye, and I was just, in addition to all the archive searches I was doing, I just Googled Bud Mukaye, and Bud Mukaye showed up as on the cover of a book by a guy named James McNaughton. And so, I was like, oh, that's an interesting topic. So what we wanted to do is really kind of find out from you some of this context and how Bud ended up on the cover of this book. And so that's what piqued my curiosity. I ended up buying the book, but not the one with Bud on the cover, but your book. And then
Here it is.
Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, JJ.
Yeah, JJ pulled it up. So that's better visual, right? So because of that, we wanted to find out from you how this connects, why you agreed to be involved in this, and what your expertise is.
Okay. Yeah, I'm a retired historian, or semi-retired. I worked as a historian for the U.S. Army for 30 years, ended up my career at the Center of Military History in Washington, D.C., doing all kinds of stuff. My first assignment as an Army civilian historian was at the Defense Language Institute. And historians are always looking for the origins of things. And so one of the first things I started digging into when I was hired as the first historian at the Defense Language Institute in beautiful Monterey, California, was how did the school begin? Why in heaven's name were the armed forces involved in training soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines in foreign languages? I mean, why don't they just go to the high schools or colleges? So first of all, I found out that the specific languages that the Defense Department is interested in back many years ago when I started and today are not necessarily what the languages that are taught in high school and college. So Arabic, Korean, Chinese, Russian, Spanish, sure, Spanish maybe, but many of the languages were rarely taught in the normal K through 12 and higher education system. And what I discovered was that, in fact, the school started in 1941 as a small Japanese language training program. It actually started before the Pearl Harbor attack, and that really piqued my curiosity. And the students were Japanese American soldiers. So we can get into the details there, but one thing led to another, and as I pursued down that rabbit hole, it ended up, growing up to a book. It took me a number of years to pull it together and write it, but I was fascinated with the origins of this foreign language training within the U.S. military, which I must say continues to this day in Monterey.
Right. So actually that's a good segue into, and one of the first things to kind of talk about was what was kind of the, relationship or dynamic between, Nisei, second generation Japanese American soldiers, and the Army or Navy, because at that point it was just two branches, right?
You're exactly right. There were two departments. It was
the
Naval Department, the Department of the Navy, which included the Marine Corps, and the Department of the Army, which included, eventually was going to become the Army Air Forces. And in 1957, they finalized the divorce and they became a separate service.
Okay. So that,
But yeah, so there were two departments. And to answer your question, the with war had already broken out in Europe in 1949. I mean, 1940, and already broken out in the Far East, as we called it then, in 1937. But Congress authorized peacetime selective service in 1940. And the way the law was written, they drafted everybody, all men, I should say, within a certain age range. And what that meant was that by the summer of 1941, there were several thousand Japanese American young men, Nisei, U.S. citizens, who were in uniform. They got drafted and they were in training or they'd been put in various assignments. And so they were sort of swept up like African Americans, like other ethnic groups, German and Italian Americans, ended up in the Army. So when the Army, a handful of Army intelligence officers in Washington wanted to find Japanese linguists, they were planning for a possible future conflict. The first place they turned was actually to universities, and they found that there was only a handful of universities who were teaching Japanese, and the Japanese they were teaching was not conversational. It was like classical Japanese literature.
Right.
So that was a non-starter. So somebody had the bright idea and said, hey, look, we have all these Japanese American soldiers. They're already in uniform. They're scattered in Army bases up and down the West Coast and also in Hawaii. Why don't we go just pick the ones that we want? So that was the impetus for it. What they found actually was the Nisei generation was so Americanized that very few of them spoke any real functional Japanese. Nathan, I'm sure your Japanese is a heck of a lot better than the average Nisei in 1941.
There's a good chance, and it's one of those things that this is going to get broadcast out there, and I'll probably get owned by somebody for saying this. But I do frequently have conversations with, especially like some Nisei, but especially Sansei and Yonsei, that they're like, "Oh yeah, you're more Japanese than I am." I'm like, well, yeah,
right.
But 10 years versus no years there. So
actually, one of the things that I learned about the Japanese American community on the West Coast was language schools. And that is that their parents, like a lot of immigrant parents, wanted their children to remain connected with the land of their heritage. And so they would make their kids go to an after-school program for, let's say, an hour a day, something like that, to learn Japanese. Every Nisei that I interviewed hated it because their buddies would go play baseball. And they had to sit in classes. They really, it didn't do very much for them. And in fact, ironically, after the war broke out, a couple of them said the Army really missed out because our sisters were much better learners in the Japanese language schools than us guys.
Well, and what's really interesting is that this is getting, to something I actually wanted to ask about way later in the interview, but, a kind of a natural, kind of thing. And so we can touch on it more later. But yeah, it was striking as I got into the later phases of your book about, as women were starting to come in to service in some small numbers, just what a missed opportunity as language instructors, as interpreters, especially during the occupation. There was so much kind of rear echelon document analysis that was happening that doesn't require, a fit male. Like it just doesn't.
Exactly.
And so, yeah, it was such wasted potential. And it was very striking.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what happened once war broke out to those Nisei that were already, starting to do language training or just generally in the Army or Navy?
So it varied. First of all, the general situation in Hawaii, there were, I think, at least 2,000 Japanese Americans in the Army. The Navy wouldn't touch them, but the Army was sort of more a better reflection of America. They went and defended the beaches. They literally defended the beaches of Hawaii along with the Caucasian soldiers and Native Hawaiians and so forth, for the first 6 months. And then in May of 1942, the Hawaiian authorities scooped up all of the Japanese Americans who were in infantry units and shipped them to the United States, and where they became the 100th Battalion that fought in Italy and France. So that's one stream of the story. On the West Coast, which you're focused on, most of them were, some were discharged immediately after. It was sort of local option what the commanders wanted to do. Most of them were shipped inland. They were stripped out of their units and moved into the interior army posts. Selective service, interestingly enough, continued for Japanese Americans until sometime in February. I haven't been able to pin down the exact date, but in mid or late February, the War Department finally said, stop sending us Japanese American draftees. We don't want them. Now, the language school was started with about 60 Nisei students at the Presidio of San Francisco. Right down the hill, literally, from Lieutenant General DeWitt's headquarters, the Western Defense Command. He's the one who carried out the removal of all people of Japanese ancestry from the West Coast. Right down the hill from his headquarters, like a 10-minute walk, was in an old airplane hangar, this language school for 60 students. All of them Nisei, except there were a couple of Caucasians they allowed in who had some Japanese capability. So by the time the Western Defense Command ordered the removals, the school was ordered to leave. So their commandant, who was a Caucasian officer, actually a Danish immigrant, Kai Rasmussen, good Danish name, in I think around April of 1942, he frantically made a tour of the Midwest looking for someplace he could move this little language school. And he met Harold Stassen, who was the governor of Minnesota. And Harold Stassen said, we have a state facility, which was actually being used as a homeless men's camp. So we'll get rid of the homeless men and you can move your Japanese American soldiers in here. So that's what happened in June of 42. The school number survived. It didn't get shut down, but they were forced to relocate into Minnesota.
And this is Camp Savage, right, in Minnesota?
Exactly. It was named Camp Savage, Minnesota.
All right.
They stayed there for 2 years. It expanded. They got more and more students, hired more instructors, but they stayed there. And finally, in 1944, they got so big, they moved on to Fort Snelling.
So then as their, the need and the demand for translators, interpreters increased, how did they start recruiting more Nisei? Was it within the army? Was it from camps? Because that time frame is, for removal and incarceration is chaotic.
Nate, you've put your finger on a critical problem, because by 1942, as I mentioned, the War Department refused to accept draftees. The Army intelligence officers had already screened the Nisei who were already in uniform, and they picked out the only ones they thought were capable of benefiting from further training. So that's why I put in the first picture, if you want to show that, JJ. This was, I believe it was Gila River, Amanchi.
So Amanchi, Colorado?
I think so, yeah. This is December of 1942. These men are literally raising their right hands, getting sworn into the U.S. Army. This was before there was a call for volunteers for the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The War Department intelligence officers somehow got an exception to policy and said, we have such a critical need for translators and interpreters. They went into all of the camps and interviewed candidates. and brought them onto active duty. Now,
Mhm.
picture, I can't explain who the guy is wearing the uniform, but I
Mhm.
suspect that he maybe had been in and then discharged and then joined his parents in the camp and showed up for this ceremony in his private's uniform. But that's just speculation. But anyway, this is in one of the incarceration camps behind barbed wires. Here's a group of young men who are recruited for military intelligence, for their own reasons. Imagine what they had been through, what their families had been through over the previous
6-8 months. Yeah. Well,
yeah.
a year at this point, right? Yeah.
Since the Imperial Japanese Navy attacked the U.S. fleet and other installations in the Far East. So yeah. So one of these guys, not in this picture, was Bud Mukaye,
Right.
who joined in November of 1942, and
Mhm.
he was specifically interviewed and recruited by military intelligence and agreed to enlist. Now, I don't know about him in particular because
Mhm.
our information is kind of sketchy on him as an individual.
Mhm.
But I do know, because I've talked to several of the guys who were recruited around this time period who had
Mhm.
to be snuck out of camp. There was a great deal of controversy and tensions within all these camps. And these are the first few months of people being in the camps. People, their lives have been devastated, families
Mhm.
have been badly disrupted. Lifetime businesses and farms were just tossed away. And then an Army recruiter shows up, So it was a hard sell. And
Mhm.
there were people in camp who didn't like having the Army recruiters there.
Right.
So some of these guys had to be snuck out in the middle of the night. But that's how passionate they were to, I don't know, either serve the nation, or I interviewed one Nisei who said he had to get out of there or else he'd go stir crazy.
Mhm.
He didn't care. He volunteered for anything just to get the hell out of the barbed wire.
Right. And that kind of makes sense with the human condition. We don't want to be locked up. And then, some people just don't want to be stuck with their family.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
the older generation took it much harder.
Mm.
The incarceration. The younger generation, particularly like teenagers and below, if you ask them honestly, they enjoyed. Oftentimes, they enjoyed aspects of living in the camps. They got
Mhm.
to eat in big cafeterias. They got to run around with their friends. The parental supervision kind of fell apart for a while. But for the older families, like I said, if you'd been farming in near Sacramento for 30 years and had a grocery store for 30 years or more, and all of that was taken away from you for no reason.
Right.
It would be,
Everything you built.
exactly. It was psychologically just devastating for the Issei generation. So in fact, I think some of the Nisei stayed into camps to support their parents.
Mm.
There were some complicated choices that had to be made.
Yeah, and we talked about some of those in another interview we did with Brian Nia, but and that was more focused on some of those things. But you're right that the choice, even before the later loyalty questionnaire thing that comes, a few months after this,
Right.
the choice is to volunteer, to stay in camp, all that stuff. Whether to try to get a
Right.
job working out. I know I interviewed some folks in college who became like migrant farm workers harvesting sugar beets, and there are all kinds of choices people were making at that point, but the choice to volunteer is interesting, and it had to be so individual. Yeah.
And the Army intelligence recruiters also went to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, to interview the Nisei with the 100th Battalion from Hawaii,
Mm-hmm.
a very different group.
Mm-hmm.
And they selected the ones that had some language ability. Before the war, the Japanese communities in Hawaii were larger,
Mm-hmm.
and you're more likely to find Japanese speakers among even the Nisei generation.
Mm-hmm.
But a number of those gentlemen didn't want to leave the combat unit. They didn't really know what the MIS was going to be, but they said, I want to go, I want to fight, I want to carry a rifle, I want to prove my patriotism on the front lines, and I don't want a desk job translating documents.
Hmm. So
Uh,
what was the
yeah.
pitch that MIS recruiters used? And was it, like white regular army officers? Was it Nisei who were already, a part of the program, or?
Yeah. Um, I think they just twisted a lot of arms when they found that the young men with the skills. I know some people like. All right, one of the Hawaiian Nisei was Hoichi Kubo, who
Hmm.
a pre-med student at the University of Hawaii before the war, got drafted earlier in 1941, and actually saw the planes attacking Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December.
Hmm. Did he live
He
in
was,
Aiea or Pearl Harbor or something? I mean, Pearl City or something?
he was at Wheeler Field at the time of the attack.
Oh, I see. Already
Yeah.
in. Okay.
I don't remember which island he grew up on.
Okay. JJ,
So
could you
Kubo,
go a couple slides up to show the class?
Yes.
Oh yeah. So yeah, the next step for these young men was the classroom.
Hmm.
And so all those books you see lined up are dictionaries, I think. So
Fun.
it was a very intensive school, and there was a lot of just sheer brain work.
Hmm.
Rising dozens of characters every single day, frequent tests. The school ran at least 6 days a week. Plus, they had military duties. They had marches with heavy packs and rifles and athletics and so forth. The initial course was 6 months long.
Hmm.
And they learned to translate. They learned some interpretation skills. One of the popular things for the students was when they had interrogation classes, they got to pretend to interrogate the instructors. These instructors, of course, lorded it over them for 5 days a week, and then they got to turn the tables and pretend to interrogate them in Japanese. So anyway, just to quickly finish with Kubo in the 100th Infantry Battalion, because I think he's a symbolic of a mindset. They gave him a test, and he did very well on the language test. No, I take it back. He flunked the language test, and they said, "We know you're cheating," and they pulled him out anyway. And so he went against his wishes. Even flunking the test deliberately didn't keep him out of the school.
Wow.
And again,
line?
Hold on one second.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure he was at Wheeler Field, correct?
Yes. All right. Hoichi Kubo was at Wheeler. Oh yeah, good. Yes. Wow. He saw the planes. He heard the explosions. He saw the smoke. He passed away in the 90s. I had the opportunity to interview him. He had been a chemistry major, and so they assigned him to the unit pharmacy. So he said that as soon as he heard the bombs dropping, he ran out of his barracks and went to the pharmacy and began unlocking all the supplies and handing out blood plasma and bandages and iodine and whatever was going to be needed, because there were an awful lot of wounded as well as killed in that attack. And
that's amazing during the heat of the moment to run back to the pharmacy, just to save people. That's an amazing.
Right. Well, I think, it's actually portrayed very well in the movie From Here to Eternity, which was actually filmed at Schofield Barracks. So, but I'll tell you more stories about Hoichi Kubo as we go along, because he's a great character. He's a great American. I'm sorry he's gone now.
Yeah, well, and if you could pull up the classroom picture, not the classroom, the line of guys at Camp Savage. Yes, this one.
Yeah.
Okay. So this picture, what I love about this picture and why I was so excited when you were talking about Hoichi Kubo is Hoichi Kubo is in there, front left. And JJ, do you see who's directly behind him?
I got to put my glasses on.
That's Bud.
That's Bud.
Bud Mukaye, directly behind him.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this class has Bud Mukaye, who we're really interested in. It has Hoichi Kubo. So this is Camp Savage, Barrack F, and I guess this is mostly folks who were recruited from the Gila River camp. And then Grant Ichikawa was in here too, and I think we'll end up talking about him probably a little bit more too. And then I think there was one person in here who was one of the very few, I'll need to find his name, MIS Nisei, who were killed in action during the war too. And I think there were only like 18 or so that were. So this class, this lined up group of people from Camp Savage in early 1942, just from looking at through the names. Yeah, but Bud Mukaye is standing right behind Hoichi Kubo.
That's crazy.
Yeah, I know. It's like this whole project for us is like all these weird small world experiences that we keep
also,
running across.
Keep in mind that particularly for the Nisei from Hawaii, or I'll say Southern California, Minnesota winters are a little bit different. So for a lot of these young men, it was the first time they saw snow. They were freezing their tails off. Initially the barracks would just have like one oil heater inside an oil stove to heat the whole barrack. So there'd be competition over whose bunk got to be closest to the heater.
Wow. Yeah, that would have been quite a change. Yeah. Wow. Because I've lived in the Pacific Northwest too, and the winters in Western Washington are still nothing like the Upper Midwest. Nothing like it. Yeah, that's a variety of cold that does not compare to just the damp and.
So another aspect is that, and I know Mukaye's mother and father were in the camp.
Mm-hmm.
These young men had a real sense of dedication because that word would get back to their families. They all came from small communities, and once the families on the mainland were incarcerated, if you failed a test or if you showed a lack of enthusiasm, the word was going to get back, and you were going to hear from your father, who might send you a stern letter, or rumors would get around. So it actually worked for the two infantry units, the 100th Battalion and the 442, fought in Europe. They were determined not to let their buddies down. Part of it was that old American team spirit, but part of it was knowing that their family was watching. And if you've looked at the newspapers, you can see the reports of casualties and awards. Somebody got a Bronze Star, man, that would be written up in the Pacific Citizen or one of the camp newspapers. So they knew, even though there wasn't social media back then, their families were watching very closely.
Yeah, I'm sure. So how were these, once these students finished language school, how would they kind of get, assigned to teams? Like, how were those teams composed? And then, when and what did they get sent to do?
The War Department G2 would send out requirements and tell them, hey, we need, let's say, 2 teams for 2 infantry divisions, and you need to be there by 30 September. You need to be on the boat from San Francisco. And so the teams were carefully put together by the school staff.
Okay.
Each division was generally allocated a 10-man team, and then 1 Caucasian lieutenant who would be their team leader. There were some Caucasians who learned Japanese or knew enough Japanese to work as team leaders. In the Army, you've got to have an officer in charge of any detail, it seems like. So what they would try to do is match up ones who are strong in speaking skills and with others who are strong in reading skills. And the ones who really were good at reading skills were the Kibe. Now, I don't know if you've explained that in your previous episodes, but the Kibe had spent time in Japan before the war. And if they'd spent several years and gone to school in Japan, they were usually pretty good at particularly the social writing. And so on the battlefields in the South Pacific and the Southwest Pacific, the Japanese army was actually a very literate paper-based army. So they were writing down every message. They were keeping diaries and letters. They had printed material. And if one of those Japanese units got overrun by an American unit, which happened on a frequent basis, then you would get masses of material that you need someone who could read. Now, printed material, probably the typical school graduate could read. But if it was a handwritten diary, you get one of those kibe to look at it and tell them, does this contain important information or not? So what they did reading documents was just to kind of skim through, see, is this really relevant or not? And then the ones who couldn't read very well but had good speaking skills, you send them to do the interrogations.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay. And then were these mainly kind of, rear echelon positions, or did they end up, ending up on the front lines either by design or accident?
Some of them, well, it was a mix.
Okay.
In the Southwest Pacific, they came up with a system using a central intelligence agency called that came out wrong, an organization called the Allied Translator and Interpreter Service. It was allied because there were some Australians and Brits in there, a handful. And they did high-level interrogations and document translation. But they also served as a pool of linguists. So, in Europe, the combat was continuous from when some unit, 1st Infantry Division, landed at Normandy in June of 1944, and they stayed in the fight all the way through to the end of the war. In the Pacific, it was different. You'd go on an operation for several weeks or a month or two, and then they'd pull you out. So these linguists would then, at the end of an operation, they'd go back sort of to the mothership, and they may or may not go out again with the same unit. So the 10 or so linguists who went with an infantry division, typically they would be assigned 2 to every regiment. So that way you get within minutes, hot off the presses intelligence. If the frontline troops captured a prisoner, and if the prisoner made it alive back to regimental headquarters, that was another issue. Then a Nisei who could interrogate them on the spot. What unit are you from? What's the name of your commanding officer? How much ammunition have you got? When was the last time you ate? Are you guys withdrawing or attacking? Are you part of a larger unit? All those basic things that commanders need to know. This is real, fingertip feel for those commanders. Regimental, division, and corps commanders were always looking for this to figure out the enemy. This warfare in World War II was a very human activity, in that you were not dropping bombs for the most part. The ground forces were not dropping bombs on anonymous targets from 30,000 feet. They were grappling, they were wrestling with a living sentient enemy, and they needed to know those basic informations. What unit are you? How much ammunition have you got? How much food? How much more food have you got left?
So I'm curious, did that kind of change from the early part of the war? Just thinking about the kind of take no prisoners and don't surrender approach of, very blunt instrument, very unforgiving nature of the Pacific War. I'd imagine there weren't very many prisoners early on. So was it mainly document translation? Did that change over the course of the war?
No, I would say both documents and prisoners gradually increased. But the American forces were not really good at taking prisoners. And the Japanese soldiers didn't want to surrender. So many soldiers who were captured had been wounded, were unconscious, and the Nisei were smart enough in dealing with somebody who grew up in Japan to use that knowledge against them. So if they were, the Japanese soldiers had been told to expect to be tortured and killed in the most horrible way. The Americans were monsters. So who shows up, the first person you see, once you get back to the headquarters, is somebody in an American uniform with a Japanese face. Says hello to you in Japanese. And in fact, he asks, hey, where are you from? And, is your father into farming? What was your village festival like? And frankly, it caught the Japanese prisoners off balance. They did not expect kindness. They did not expect someone to offer them a drink of water or a cigarette. But also the Japanese army, their doctrine was, you will never surrender. And that was the extent of their security training. None of this, captured, I will
name, rank, serial number.
There you go. None of. So once they realized they weren't going to get tortured and killed, some of them became very loquacious. And especially if the Nisei had been on an operation for a while, they could say, hey, look, we know you're from the 110th Infantry Regiment. We know the regimental commander. We already know that, you're out of ammunition for your howitzers. Now tell us about your company or your battalion. So you use that information. For some of the recalcitrant ones, another technique I heard the Nisei would sometimes use, they would say, if you don't tell us what we want to know, we're going to shave your beard off and take your picture and mail it back to your family.
Ooh.
Yeah, that apparently usually worked. That was their last resort because the Japanese militarist government back in the home islands would not treat the family well if they found out that their son had surrendered to the Americans. So that was in that sense, they used the family ties. So here's Art Uchiro and Bill Ishio interrogating, I believe this was in New Guinea in early 1943.
Okay.
And the guy on the far left is a Caucasian officer who looks very bored. I don't know how you read that picture. But you've got two days, say you got a hastily constructed table with a candle on it. This is a nighttime scene. And there's a Japanese soldier lower down. Okay. So, they're establishing who's boss in this situation. I think the guy in the far background with his arms crossed might be a security guard or it might be another intelligence officer. And they're having a conversation.
So that reminds me, security guards for prisoners make sense, but I read something in your book also about how the Nisei interpreters also needed security guards, right?
Yes. When they were signed up to the front lines, they would typically go with a Caucasian security guard. Because honestly, in the battlefields of the South Pacific, New Guinea and the Philippines, all the soldiers started looking alike. After you've been out in the mud and the rain for a couple weeks.
The color of your uniform is just mud.
Exactly. And so, they would go out with a security guard. There's some controversy, and some of the veterans I interviewed thought, that these guys were checking up on them or, making they wouldn't do anything disloyal. I think that's probably overblown, but they were definitely in need of security. In the rear areas, no, I don't think. The intelligence center in Honolulu in 44 and 45 with several hundred Nisei. There was the one in Brisbane. They were enjoying life in a city in Australia during the war. And they, could go to hotels and restaurants and bars on their off-duty hours. I know that one of them told me a story that when he went into a bar once and an Australian came up to him and said, "Where are you Japs from?" And he started to get belligerent until one of his buddies said, no, he said, "Where are you chaps from?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
English isn't English universally. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, but definitely they did need security guards.
Mm-hmm.
And several, as you've already mentioned, several were killed in action
Mm-hmm.
Because they were that close to the front lines.
Mm-hmm. So, what this is going back just a little bit, and not at all related to sumo, but I'm just curious. What kind of, I don't know, you mentioned, the lack of kind of interrogation or becoming a POW training in the Japanese military, but what kind of gaps, problems, errors in kind of, I don't know, intelligence security, communications were kind of revealed on the Japanese side because of the presence of these, interpreters?
The American commanders tried to find out as much as they could about the Japanese forces because they did not want to fight. I mean, the war was brutal enough, but they didn't want to fight just a brutal war of attrition. The American commanders wanted to fight smart. MacArthur, in particular, liked to leapfrog around major concentrations of Japanese forces, famously. In fact, even when he returned to the Philippines in late 1944, MacArthur didn't target the big island of Luzon. He went to an obscure island in the center of the archipelago called Leyte. Maybe we could talk about later. But this was based on an awful lot of intelligence. Now, some of it was signals intelligence, high-level radio intercepts. Some of it was on captured documents and interrogating prisoners.
And there were like Philippine guerrillas operating in the Philippines too, right? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Well, so the leapfrogging reminded me that so Bud Mukaye, you said, I think you found this. I didn't find this, that he served with the 7th Infantry Division that landed on Leyte, right? Okay.
That's right. That's right.
Okay. And then there was a leapfrogging thing I read about in Leyte where, the 7th Infantry Division went clear to the west side of the island, but then they were kind of stuck along a river. And then amphibious tanks went out to sea along the west side and then fired at the reverse slope on Japanese positions to provide cover. And I was like, wait, just amphibious tanks? You're just going to send them around? But I guess MacArthur.
Yeah, well, that was General Kruger of the Army. But the important thing about Leyte was that the Americans thought it was going to be a brilliant strategic move and it would be over in a few days. The Japanese commander in the Philippines had concentrated most of his forces on Luzon. And he made the decision that once the Americans landed on Leyte, he brought in reinforcements. He would do it by maritime shipping because the islands were so close. And the Americans, instead of having a quick pushover, had like 5 or 6 weeks of very intense combat, plus the monsoons, plus a typhoon swept through. And really the whole point was to capture airfields. And the engineers looking at maps said, oh, I can put an airfield there. And when they got there in the heavy rains, they found it was very, very difficult to construct airfields on those soils. And it was a tough one.
Okay.
This one, by the way, go back to the color, the oil painting. Yeah, we're not necessarily going to talk about the Aleutian Islands, but the Army and Navy sent artists out on these campaigns and to document it. Of course, they had photographers, but they also had artists. And this is the only painting I was able to find of an interrogation going on. This is in the Aleutians, probably on the island of Attu, after the fighting was over. And once again, you have a couple officers sitting at a wooden table, a prisoner of war who is sitting lower than everyone else. And the guy standing up with his hands on his knees is a Nisei linguist who is asking questions. Early in the war, the War Department doctrine was that the Caucasian officers would ask the questions and the Nisei would just translate and then translate the answer back again. And pretty soon that proved to be completely unworkable.
Yes.
The Nisei would spend hours sometimes with these prisoners, and then they'd come back and spend hours on a typewriter typing up their reports. Detailed reports. Here's the name of the prisoner, his rank, his unit, his entire military service, information about his unit, and they'd actually put it on a mimeographing machine. And some of these still survive in the archives, these interrogation reports. But and then those would get collected at higher and higher levels, and then other intelligence personnel could read through them and pull out what they wanted.
Okay.
I find this fascinating that this painting is almost identical to this.
Yeah.
Just
right.
like the layout, the
That's
security officer in the back, like it's.
And one is in
wild.
the Aleutian Islands, and one is on New Guinea. Yeah, about the same time frame, but yeah, that's right. So yeah, the American authorities were able to get a great deal of information about the Japanese. The senior intelligence officials like MacArthur's G2, General Willoughby, later said that he felt that the Nisei had shortened the war by as much as 2 years. He was prone to exaggeration, but it shortened the war somewhat. And so
really
certainly
quick,
saved a lot of American lives.
Really quick, you mentioned G2 a couple times. What's that for kind of a lay audience?
Yeah. In World War II, the typical Army staff had 4 assistant chiefs of staff for personnel, this G1. Intelligence was G2. It was just shorthand. Operations was G3. Logistics was G4.
Okay, all right.
Some of that survives to this day.
Wow. So I think we went ahead just a little bit with one of the slides, but as the war kind of progresses, this you said is Kubo, right? That you talked about earlier.
This is Kubo. I'm not sure if it's at the school or before he left Hawaii. He's already a tech sergeant. I date this photo exactly, but he's a clean-cut young man. Now he's in the Army. And then I have a subsequent picture of him on Saipan. He also, on Saipan, another aspect of what he did was, we were talking about interrogations. Saipan was a hard, bitter fight for the Marines and the Army. And it came to a point in the battle after the first 2 or 3 weeks when all the Japanese forces were going to make one last massive attack. They were going to drive the Americans off the island. And he interrogated a wounded prisoner. And the wounded prisoner talked about, there's this big attack coming tomorrow. And he used the Japanese word gyokusai. And first heard
shattered
that
jewel or
a shattered jewel. And Kubo knew enough Japanese language and culture to understand that this is what the Japanese Army referred to, put it all on the table. We're going to smash the enemy. And so he quickly reported it back. The attack did come the next morning, and it almost broke through the American lines with the 27th Infantry Division. He was attached to the 27th. But they might have broken if his information hadn't gotten back and say, hey, they're coming in a few more hours because of this prisoner.
Wow.
But then,
go ahead.
Then the next, I love this picture. This is also Hoichi Kubo. He's been in the battle for a couple weeks, so his uniform isn't looking starched. And this is a young, I think, a Japanese child on Saipan. Saipan was the first island in the whole island hopping campaigns where there's a substantial civilian population there. The Japanese had been running, before the war, sugar plantations, and there were a number of Korean laborers there as well. So some of those people who ended up behind barbed wire on Saipan were not Japanese at all. They might have been Taiwanese or Korean laborers. Some of them were slave laborers. And there were some Japanese families. So here he is showing his compassionate side.
Wow.
Shortly after this,
Go ahead.
after the Japanese forces were themselves shattered on Saipan, Saipan is basically based on coral, and it's riddled with caves. And a number of Japanese soldiers and civilians were hiding in caves. And one day, the word came back to Kubo's command post that there was a large number of Japanese soldiers holding a group of civilians in a cave on the coast of Saipan. So he went forward and went down on a rope over the edge of a cliff by himself, and called out to the Japanese soldiers and said, "Hey, I come in peace. I'm unarmed." He told me he took his helmet off because he knew that if they saw an American helmet, they would shoot him. But he did tuck a 45 in the back of his waistband, he said, and some rations. So he went in.
Is America.
That's the most American thing I've ever heard.
He went in and had a 2-hour conversation. There were I think he said 7 or 8 Japanese soldiers in there. First of all, he figured out the highest rank was like senior private, and he was a sergeant in the American Army. So he made it clear, hey, I outrank you guys. Furthermore, both of his grandfathers had fought in the Imperial Japanese Army during the Russo-Japanese War. And apparently what were very prestigious units in that war. And so he was able to talk, to these guys and say, my grandfathers were in a better unit than your crappy unit. And, you better listen to me. But the key thing he said was, and this is all, conversation in Japanese with his enemies. Key thing he said was, look, if you want to give your lives for the emperor, that's your business. But there was over 100 civilians in the cave. He said, the emperor doesn't oblige you to have these civilians killed. So just let them go. So sure enough, after a lot of discussion around the campfire, and it helped that he shared his rations with them. I think they probably hadn't had food for a while. They let the civilians go, and then most of the Japanese soldiers then surrendered themselves. For that, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, which was the highest award that any MIS Nisei received during the war. A number of them got silver stars and bronze stars. He was the only one who got the Distinguished Service Cross.
Mm-hmm. And is just below the Congressional Medal of Honor, or
that's the next one down. That's
okay.
Right.
Second highest. Okay.
Yeah.
Which is a big deal.
Very rare. It's the equivalent of the cross as well.
Okay. Wow. Yeah.
So here's using his language skills, his cultural knowledge, his bravery, and also his compassion as an American, as a human being, to somehow mitigate the awful cost of war.
And that's something that was interesting in your book that you kind of pointed out, that to a certain extent, I don't know, when you wrote about how the Nisei soldiers, MIS Nisei, didn't really have the option of setting aside the humanity of the enemy. There's this intense racial animus that was there on both sides in the Pacific War between, white soldiers and Japanese soldiers, white American soldiers and Japanese soldiers. But the Nisei didn't have that option, not only kind of culturally and from their own background, but also their job was to relate to people as humans, right? To get the most information out of them.
Right. And even frankly, translating diaries and letters, sometimes blood stains on them. You may be behind the far back in the rear lines, safe, sleep, warm bunk, but you're reading someone's diary that is dead. And here's their thoughts about their family, their letters to their loved ones, photographs of their families. They didn't have the luxury of demonizing their enemy.
Mm-hmm.
I have a question for you guys.
Yes.
Of course, I guess the little bit that I know about sumo from this time period is that it was associated with Shinto, and it may have been associated too closely with kind of, the Japanese militarism that was being promulgated frankly, by the Japanese government in the 20s and 30s. And I'm surprised that the authorities in the States allowed it to continue, even in the assembly centers and the camps.
Yeah. So it's really interesting because you saw a bunch of those pictures, and
Yeah.
what's exciting for me, I'm not even a professional historian, just an amateur historian. What's really exciting is there's been a grand total of one previous scholar doing any work on mainland American sumo, like pre-war
Right.
sumo, like one person, Dr. Azuma at UPenn.
Mhm.
And that work he did was over 25 years ago. So we're kind of the first people touching this topic. So some of
Yeah.
the things that were available to Dr. Azuma at the time were there were fewer pictures, fewer documents, fewer records digitized. So kind of I think some of the early impressions people had was that sumo kind of happened pre-war, maybe happened a tiny bit in the camps, but what we're seeing, we're going to have future episodes about it, is that there were not only happening at assembly centers like Santa Anita, which Bud Mukaye was champion of the Santa Anita tournament that happened, but there was one in Gila River there. There were later in the war inter-camp tournaments where people were allowed, sumo teams were allowed to travel between camps to compete against each other. And there were sumo tournaments not just in Tule Lake or Crystal City or the Santa Fe camp, which were where the kind of the Issei and the I don't know, the disloyal Japanese were put, right? And so it was happening at Amachi, it was happening at Gila River, it was happening at a variety of camps. And so Brian Nia, who we interviewed, was talking a little bit about how there were all kinds of activities, baseball, and that a lot of it was people within the camps going, we got to kill time, we're stuck here, what are we going to do? Yeah. But also that the WRA kind of mindset was, this is an ordered removal, but we don't want to indefinitely incarcerate. We want these to be kind of like mini American cities and communities, and this is part of community life, so have community life. And so, yeah, I was likewise surprised, but it was very interesting.
Because the official government policy was to stamp out Japanese-ness in the camps. You had to be a U.S. citizen to be in the position of any authority. So that's when the Nisei rose up above their parents, which was also probably very difficult for all concerned. And there are stories at the beginning of the evacuations of families burning photographs, burning religious texts, just trying to destroy anything that would associate them with Japan. And so, but sumo somehow survived for a while at least. Of course, baseball is the one sport that is much talked about in the Japanese community at that time.
Yes. And I think one thing that's interesting, and we'll talk about it more in one of our later narrative episodes, but even just kind of the story of Bud Mukaye, a person who was his co-coach at the Los Angeles Sumo Club, Joe Hiraga. Joe Hiraga was likewise sent to a concentration camp, and their paths just radically diverged at that point. Because Bud Mukaye volunteers early on, November 1942. Joe Hiraga was a no in the loyalty questionnaire, went to Tule Lake, stayed at Tule Lake all the way until in March of 1946. So he clearly and considered revoking his U.S. citizenship and repatriating to Japan. And so, but these were co-coaches. They ran a sumo club together. And so these really complicated choices people were making at the time, and the very different takeaway. But I do think, just because, JJ and I both do amateur sumo and we're in the same club, he's my coach. There is something to, I imagine they were probably doing keiko practice in Japanese. A lot of their coaches were pro wrestlers who came from Japan and were coaching them. So, their language, especially conversational Japanese, was probably very good. And, they're young men of action, So I imagine, that contributed to Bud being a pretty effective, probably especially a frontline interrogator.
Right.
I would just guess. Anyway, that wove around. I'm sorry.
Right. I hope we can talk a little bit about the occupation. And I don't know what Bud did specifically, but in general terms, the CIC did some interesting missions during the occupation.
Yeah.
I know he also served in the Battle of Okinawa, which was
a
reversion to the First World War trench warfare.
Yeah. So if you could move to the next slide, JJ, the one that shows this is Lady, just so we could just kind of get a slight visual for the audience. Before that one, I think. Yeah. So you talked about the logistical problems and the rain and everything on Lady. That's what the picture here on the right is showing is Filipino porters, trying to supply the units there on Lady.
Right. So in the Philippines, the civilian population was very pro-American, and they were drafted to help out. Okinawa was a different story.
Right. And I think the next picture of Harry Fukuhara is also from the Philippines. But yeah, then we can kind of get to talking about. So we don't have to necessarily spend a lot of time on Harry Fukuhara unless you want to, but I do want to plug a book that my dad recommended to me and gave to me about Harry Fukuhara and his family, who Harry was in the MIS. And
Nathan, can you put that picture up again, please? Or that book? Great, thank you.
Yeah, that's a good read. And I had a chance to get to know Harry Fukuhara before he passed away. He moved to the San Jose area early 90s. And
he's originally from Auburn, Washington, right?
Yeah, went to Washington.
Where I used to live.
University of Washington, I think. Yeah. Here, this picture here is when he was commissioned. Towards the end of the war, he accepted a commission as a second lieutenant of infantry. And he's wearing the combat infantryman badge there. Very an intellectual, I should say. College graduate. He was a Kibe, and also joined, I think, in late 42, and made a career in military intelligence. He's one of the ones who stayed on after the end of the war.
And he had family. Most of his family were from Hiroshima, correct?
Exactly. And that's very poignant. He had visited there and spent, I think he'd gone to school before the war in Hiroshima. And his mother and I think 3 of his brothers were in Japan during the war. And yet this is a dilemma. It's sort of like the American Civil War. We think of it as North versus South, but it wasn't really. There were many, many divided families where a brother would, fight for the North and a brother for the South, or the family would be radically split over. So, yeah. And so I also mentioned in my book, Harry tells the story of early in the occupation. I think in the first few weeks of the occupation, he took a train from Tokyo down to Hiroshima and to visit, just to see what had happened to his parents. And his mother survived. He was able to find her. She had not seen her son for about 5 years. And here he is. He shows up as a lieutenant in the U.S. Army.
Wow.
And he told me that he had an older brother who was upstairs in bed and was too sick to get out of bed. And he didn't know then what was wrong. And he died a few months later of intense radiation poisoning. He'd been too close to the epicenter on the 6th of August.
Yeah, and I think he spent, in addition to his career in intelligence, he also spent a big chunk of his kind of post-war life also, working to kind of bridge that kind of relationship between the U.S. and Japan too, right? Right.
We Americans sometimes forget that Japan is now our strongest ally, and it's because of, in large part, because of a number of Nisei like Harry Fukuhara, who devoted their careers. A handful became diplomats. Harry State in military intelligence, retired as a colonel, and then continued as an Army civilian in the intelligence field. But his special skill set was liaison between Japanese authorities and American intelligence authorities.
Wow. JJ, could you show the pictures from Okinawa? I think it's the slide I inserted. Yeah. So on the left, I think this is an American soldier checking an aperture of a bunker. And then these are young Okinawan boys who were, conscripted into the Japanese army and then became POWs. Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about Okinawa and the battle and MIS role there?
The landings took place on the 1st of April, 1945, and it was a joint Army and Marine operation. The Navy was fully occupied by a new technique the Japanese were using. They tested on Leyte, and that was to have suicide bombing planes that were just devastating the U.S. Navy. And the longer the battle went on, the more the Navy had to hang around, and the more they were exposed to these horrible kamikaze attacks. The HBO series, The Pacific, the next episode is just a horrific, depressing episode of the fighting on Okinawa. In that case, it profiles E.B. Sledge, who was a Marine enlisted man, but it gives you a sense of how awful it was. And so part of the business was going up to a picture like this, or a cave, or an opening in a rock, and seeing if there's any hostiles in there. The easiest thing to do is just throw a grenade in and be done with it. There was over 100,000 civilians on the island, many of them Okinawan speaking. And so Nisei, wherever possible, would try to get loudspeakers and call out to these people who are hiding and say, please come out. We don't want to kill you. The battle is over. Your fight is done. You fought an honorable fight. Please surrender. We have food. We have your friends. Come. We'll take care of you. It was a very, very dangerous business to do that. And some of the Nisei wounded in this cave talking, they called it. I think they were able to lower the civilian casualty toll somewhat. Of course, they immediately had the problem with what do you do with tens of thousands of civilian refugees? You need someone who can speak the language. I mean, at this point, they didn't have any Google Translate. So, you could find a few people who spoke Japanese. But again, some of the civilians they encountered were Korean laborers or Taiwanese. There were a small number of Okinawan speaking interpreters in the MIS. The ones that I know about were recruited from Hawaii, where there's an Okinawan population.
Yeah.
And so some of them had spent years living with their grandparents, let's say, or going to school in Okinawa. They were very, very valuable for dealing with the local population.
Yeah, I saw an oral history interview of one of the MIS, Kibe, who had gone to school in Okinawa, and he was talking about interrogating, running across one of his old school teachers, and then interrogating two of his old classmates, and him basically just trying to play a trick on them, of basically, I know everything about you. I know who, I know where you went to school. I know where you went to, where you lived. Do you remember this classmate that you had? And then finally at the end saying like, I'm that classmate.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a lot of really strange intersecting stories that happen.
So remember, America and Hawaii and Japan, there was in the interwar years, there was a lot of movement back and forth. Apparently you could get a fairly cheap steamship ticket if you wanted to go back and spend a year with your grandparents or go find a wife. or if in some cases, a Nisei, let's say his father would die, and the mother would decide, well, I'm going to take kids back to my parents in Japan. So a lot of exchange back and forth. The Americans sometimes ran across Japanese who had spent time in the United States and spoke decent English. And in fact, by the time the occupation of Japan happened, there were hundreds or perhaps several thousand Nisei who had been trapped in Japan during the war. And many of them took jobs with the occupation authorities because they were bilingual.
Yeah, there's one young man who grew up in Colorado, born in Colorado, who went to Japan to become a pro sumo wrestler in 1937. His name was Harley Ozaki, but his wrestled under the name Toyonishiki. And he was climbing the ranks in sumo, never had a losing record, but he was a U.S. citizen. And when he was still wrestling in pro sumo until 1944, when he was drafted into the Japanese army. But after the war, he worked for the U.S. occupation as an interpreter.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
So let me talk about the occupation a little. The 441st Counterintelligence Corps detachment, initially they wanted to root out any evidence of militarism or a comeback by the Japanese government at any level. But unlike in Germany, the Japanese government basically remained intact after the war. And so the American occupation authorities weren't directly administering governance on the islands. They were supervising the Japanese government. The Japanese Navy Department became the Navy Demobilization Bureau because they had all the personnel records. So, they were able to bureaucratically discharge all the Navy personnel, and the War Ministry became a demobilization bureau that systematically demobilized all the Japanese soldiers.
There were millions of Japanese soldiers scattered all over the East Asia at that point, right?
So a lot of the effort was bringing them back to home islands. So that was occurring for at least a year, I think. Some of them were Japanese Navy vessels that had been demilitarized and were used for transportation. What really worried the American authorities was those who had been captured in 1945 by the Soviets.
Yes, my aunt's father was captured by the Soviets in Manchuria, and he was there until the mid-50s.
Yeah. So, and often they were working in the mines and the factories, and the Soviets didn't want to let them go for economic reasons. So for the next several years, boatloads in good weather, boatloads of former Japanese prisoners of war I think they left for Manchuria and went to ports on the west coast of Japan. Maizuru is commonly mentioned. They were all screened by CIC personnel, and that might have included Mukaye. Look at the passenger manifest and look at lists of names, and then they, I think, asked the returnees to fill out questionnaires, and then the Nisei would interview them based on the questionnaires and would try to pick out. It wasn't so much the war criminals they were looking for, I don't think. They were looking for communist infiltrators because the Soviets were trying to take advantage of having a captive audience, literally, and inculcating them in the glories of communism. And there was a communist party in Japan that had survived the war after much suppression, but they sprang up again. And the American authorities, once they were satisfied that the militarists were not coming back and that the emperor would not, stage an uprising, the American authorities turned their attention to the communist threat. So they also pursued war crimes. And this photograph here is, I think, the only one that I've been able to find of a Nisei interpreter at an actual trial. And so the defendant is on the left, looking very stiff and formal. I don't know who he is. The American judges are on the right, And the judges, of course, don't speak any English. I mean, don't speak any Japanese. So the Nisei is the one. And imagine having someone's life in your hands just as an interpreter to deliver the questions to him in a language he can understand, wait for his response, and then interpret that response back up to the judges listening in. That may determine whether he's going to get, 10 years in jail or get hanged or get let off scot-free.
Yeah, one, and just thinking about the variable kind of level of language proficiency, but even specialization, it's a different thing to interrogate a, private, on Okinawa, or even be a POW pen guard, which, some of the Nisei did, to now I'm an interpreter where I'm translating things to and from a general, who commanded, divisions and armies, or scientists who ran, biological weapons experiment programs, things like that. That's very, very technical.
Yep. So not every Nisei linguist was qualified to do this kind of interpreting. In addition to the famous Tokyo war crimes trials, there were other war crimes trials happening in Manila and Yokohama and a few other places. And the Allies, the Chinese had war crimes trials. The Australians did as well. But this was, I think, in Tokyo. So that's a different use of a foreign language to do this kind of interpreting in a legal context.
Wow.
Yeah, this is extremely complicated. Just think about your grasp on English and Japanese that you're going to have, like, in such a, like, precise, like, surgical use of the language. It's quite wild.
Yeah, because even being a court interpreter, I'm sure, is challenging, but then to be a court interpreter where it's specifically certain kinds of war crimes, that would be very challenging.
And the two languages, and Nathan, the two languages don't exactly match up word for word. Yeah. One Nisei told me the story of he was interpreting at a trial, and the white officer asked the question. He translated it for the Japanese defendant, and the defendant answered "hi" with a certain of his head, and so the Nisei turned around that he says no, and judges knew enough Japanese to say, well, hi means yes, doesn't it? So, well, in this case, I'm pretty clear that the defendant meant hi to mean
Yeah.
I hear you rather than yes.
So that's something that I'm curious about, is the level of kind of understanding of nuance that would come from, say, a Nisei, especially a Nisei Kibe, versus, say, a white officer who might have been at, like, a military attaché or university educated, as far as, when they're reading a diary or they're interviewing somebody about these kind of like cultural subtexts, about somebody's being sarcastic or being disrespectful about their commander if they phrase something a certain way, or they hold them in high esteem, all these sorts of things. Right.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a gradation of language skill, and the leaders who were managing these linguists had to know who were their top guys. And, you already mentioned it, you had Nisei who were just helping with the prisoner of war stockades, do basic conversational Japanese with the poorly educated enlisted Japanese POWs. And that's where you'd put, the bottom half of the class. Look, at any school you go to, there's going to be a bottom half of the class. And, they can contribute to society too. That's right. Necessarily in this context.
Yeah. So this reminds me of something else, just that's very different, is going back a little bit. What kind of missed opportunities were there on the American side from kind of the lack of qualified linguists early on in the war, or cultural understanding, or things like that? What I've heard you kind of talk about a war waged with, flamethrowers and, versus, a more kind of targeted, smart way of fighting?
I think once the Nisei had proved their effectiveness in combat in Guadalcanal and in New Guinea, those are the two critical places, plus on Attu in May of 43. By that point, when the commanders woke up to the value of the intelligence they were getting, they demanded more, and which is why the school kept expanding and expanding. They burst the seams at Camp Savage, so by the middle of 44, they moved on to Fort Snelling, and they were continuing to ramp up when the war ended. And it's always important to remember that no one knew the war was going to end in August or September of 1945. The Americans were gearing up for a massive invasion of the southernmost island, Kyushu, in November of 1945, to be followed the next spring by invasion right into the Kanto Plain.
So that was what, Olympic and Coronet, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and in fact, the War Department Chief of Intelligence, the G2, weeks after the end of the surrender, came out to Fort Snelling and addressed the students and said, "Guys, the war is over, and all the other soldiers are being demobilized, discharged, but you're not going to, because we need you now more than ever, and we're not going to let you go." So there were a few of the combat veterans from 1942 and 43 that were given discharge by that point, but most of them, the school continued recruiting and sending linguists to the occupation. So they were still very much needed.
Yeah, and I was seeing that Bud Mukaye was there in Japan. I mean, he came back to the US for training, but he was in Japan 1951, I think, according to one of his kind of, comrades. And then I saw his father's 1955 application for naturalization for US citizenship says that Bud is still in Japan. In 1955. So that's well after the U.S. occupation.
Well, officially, yeah.
Yeah.
Of course, the Korean War broke out, and Japan became a very important support base for the United Nations campaigns on the Korean Peninsula. But the U.S. authorities, even after Japan regained its sovereignty, they were still concerned about, frankly, the communist influence in the trade union. There was still censoring the news media, newspapers, magazines, films, for which they needed a large number of people who were able to read and speak Japanese. But more and more then in cooperation with the Japanese authorities. And also the CIC has a mission to counter the black market. And there was a lot of black market activity during the occupation. And so the CIC were like, the cops on the beat, trying to find out who was stealing out the back of the warehouse or taking boxes off the backs of trucks, and, gambling rings and fencing rings. So they were doing law enforcement activities as well.
Okay. So when you say black market, it was just like basically petty crime?
Well, yeah, cigarettes, booze, spare parts, cloth, food items. Yeah, I mean, petty crime, but sometimes it was pretty large organizations, criminal rings that were doing this.
Yeah, I mean, it was an era that saw really big expansion and kind of cornering of certain markets by the Japanese Yakuza at the time. There was so much wartime rebuilding happening, so much wartime kind of surplus flowing through the country. So a combination of kind of construction industry, dock workers, gambling, prostitution, all that sort of stuff that the Yakuza really started cornering at the time. And the other thing that's not talked about as much is also there were a lot of Formosans, Taiwanese, and Koreans trapped in Japan after World War II, and couldn't really return home because the Chinese Civil War and the Korean conflict. And so, a lot of them were almost stateless. So, the Yakuza, for a lot of those men, especially, were a way to kind of carve out a place in Japanese society. So a lot of the early Yakuza were ethnically Korean or Formosan. Anyway.
Right. And then circling back to sumo, I don't know the story. You probably know some of it. But Japanese society was trying to figure out how much of their heritage was not toxic. They do, different kinds of theater.
Mm-hmm.
Kabuki. Was kabuki okay, or was it tainted by some sort of wartime connections?
Yeah.
They revived kabuki. In music, in publications, a pre-war magazine, would it be allowed to continue to exist, or something like sumo? And of course, that was happening in spades in the United States as the Japanese Americans came back from the camps on the West Coast.
Yes.
Flower arranging, that's pretty non-controversial. But the study of the Japanese language, no, I don't think, those language schools, I don't think came back.
Yeah, well, and it is a really interesting thing how much you look at some of those early reports. I think you said something wonderful, that even though flawed, some of those early reports, like say the House Un-American Activities Committee reports, though flawed when read carefully, still contain a lot of useful information. And the opinions about Japanese language schools, like reading some of those, it's not very nuanced, and it's like, okay, the teachers can try to teach all that, but like you were talking about, the Nisei kids, like they didn't care. They wanted to be out playing baseball,
Right. And also, by the way, another little sidelight, and you'd appreciate this with your Japanese skill, which I do not have. A couple of the guys I interviewed said that when they first met a real Japanese prisoner to interrogate, that sometimes these guys laughed at them because they had learned Japanese in the kitchen from their mothers.
Right.
So why would that be a problem?
Yeah, all the Japanese, women talk to men talk to women, kids of the same age of the same sex talk to each other. Japanese has all these nuances.
Yeah, so apparently, the way it was explained to me, they would be addressing a male prisoner of war
like their mom would address somebody.
Like a mother would address someone. Yeah.
Yep.
So that kind of cultural nuance, I think that got knocked out of them pretty quick.
I'm sure it did.
I think that's what makes it so impressive that that they leveled up from there, right? Where they're able to interrogate people naturally and with like different dialects and stuff like that, because just like America, as we move through, everybody speaks a little different.
Right. And this, going back to the loyalty issue for a minute, I don't think loyalty is in your blood. I don't think you can look at somebody and say, oh, you're of Japanese heritage, therefore you can't be loyal. And also, people react to the situation they're put in. Okay, so if you put them behind barbed wire and then they say, hell no, I'm not going to volunteer for the Army.
Yeah.
Don't call them disloyal.
Right.
They time. Or if you say, do you renounce your allegiance to the emperor? And they say, well, no. I mean, what? Why?
I never had any allegiance to the emperor.
I never had an allegiance to the emperor. And you're asking me to renounce? Is this a trick question, So if people are treated well, they can follow their higher instincts. If you abuse people, don't be surprised if they lash out or if they get resistant in some way.
Mm-hmm.
So, some Japanese chose to resist the draft and became the no-no boys and went to federal prison because of it. Mm-hmm. And others decided to join and serve their country. And I even heard Senator Dan Inoue from Hawaii once give a speech in which he said, for years he thought that the no-no boys who refused to join, even get drafted, for years he thought they were just cowards. And later in life, as he matured, he realized that they were standing up for their country, for their constitution, just as much as he was when he volunteered from Hawaii to join the 442nd. So yeah, the Congress awarded Nisei soldiers of World War II the Congressional Gold Medal in 2010. And what I like about this is it says the Military Intelligence Service across the top. That's just an artistic design. And that's the Sphinx, which is the symbol of military intelligence. And then on the left, lower left, is the 100th Battalion, and the lower right is the Torch of Liberty that was adopted by the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. But anyway, I'd like to see the Military Intelligence Service on top as part of their brothers in the other combat units.
And then I just wanted to pull up this. Let's see. The No-No Boys. Can you speak about the No-No Boys a little bit and just what that means?
Right. It's a little bit of a misnomer because the term No-No Boys refers to the loyalty questionnaire that was administered in the camps in early 1943. And there were two questions that were particularly obnoxious, I'll say. Yeah, there it is from Densho. I forget, I think it's 27 and 28. One of them was, will you serve in the armed forces of the United States in any capacity? Yes or no? Well, this also, the first version of the questionnaire went to women as well and people of all ages. So, a 70-year-old man is asked, will you serve in the armed forces, without question? But the one that really stuck in their craw was the one that asked them, will you renounce allegiance to the emperor? And so those who answered no to both questions were eventually segregated. Yeah, there's the questionnaire. Yeah, great, you've got it. They were segregated, and many of them were sent to Tule Lake. But the No Boys that have come down to history started in 1943. 1944. In 1943, the War Department asked for volunteers, and a number of Nisei volunteered for combat service from Hawaii and out of the camps. God bless them. I don't know what I would have done, but they volunteered. But there was volunteer. In early 1944, the War Department changed its policy to begin the draft again. They said, okay, now the War Department was giving instructions to the selective service system and said, all right, we now find Japanese Americans acceptable to the military. And they began the draft. So literally, some of these young men got their draft notices in the camps. So here they are behind barbed wires, and then they get this telegram or letter from Uncle Sam saying, we're going to take you into the Army. In fact, it was kind of a bureaucratic confusion because a lot of them had registered for the draft in Fresno and San Diego and Los Angeles and Seattle and Tacoma. And those draft boards had no idea where those guys had gone. But anyway, they sorted it out. So at that point, several dozen young men in several of the camps, Heart Mountain, I think was one, said no. He said, I'd be glad to serve. You could draft me once you let my family out of prison. And the federal judge didn't like that argument, and they were convicted. I forget the exact number, 40 or 50 went to federal penitentiary, and they had to wait until the President Truman gave a pardon to all World War II those convicted of draft offenses. I forget. You could look that up, 46, 47. Wow. So they went to jail for their convictions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So those are the ones we refer to as the No-No Boys.
So I had one thing I wanted to kind of get back to, because you mentioned these language teams and, seeing the ranks of most of the Nisei. They were sergeants, right? And then you mentioned Harry Fukuhara became a lieutenant. Was there explicit discrimination as far as Nisei being able to become officers during the early part of the war? Did that change at some point?
A handful were sent to officer candidate school starting in 1943.
Okay.
By 1944, a few more were going to OCS in Australia. Actually, the U.S. Army had a camp there, or in the United States. By early 1945, the War Department gave local commanders authority to give direct commissions.
Okay.
So without any special schooling, just to pick their top enlisted men for, all specialties, not just the Nisei, and award direct commissions. So that's how Harry and several dozen others who had served in the Philippines were commissioned. Harry Fukuhara, by the way, never went to basic training. He liked to talk about this. He was when he was first enlisted. He said, "Well, aren't you going to send me to basic training?" They said, "No, we're going to send you to the language school, and then you go to basic training." So when he graduated from the language school at Camp Savage, they said, "Okay, we're going to send you to the South Pacific." And he said, "Well, wait, He said, "I never was trained how to fire a rifle." He said, "Well, I'm sorry, your services are urgently required." And they sent him to Australia and then up to the New Guinea and the Philippines. When he was commissioned, he said, "I've never been through basic training." So he's retired as a colonel with over 30 years of service without ever having gone through basic training.
Well, and you pointed out he had that combat infantry badge on his collar, right?
Yeah.
And okay, all right.
Yeah. So some were allowed to become officers at the very end. There was one catch, though, at the end of the war. If you were enlisted for the duration of the war in 6 months. If you were offered a commission, it was indefinite.
Ooh.
And so there were some guys, and I think I read an anecdote about Bud, that he was offered a commission and he said absolutely not. And I know that's a truth because my father-in-law fought in Europe in World War II with the 9th Division, landed at Normandy, fought all the way into Germany. And at the end of the war, he says he was offered a commission, and he knew the war had not ended in Japan against Japan yet. And he had just survived the combat in France and Germany. He said,
8 months. Yeah.
Forget that. So he took a discharge and turned down a commission. So I think there was a lot of that going on. Remember, there was that gap between Germany surrendered in May and the Japanese fought on for several more months.
Yeah, it's interesting because I'm really just so curious about Bud's kind of post-war kind of life and even late war kind of decision making, because you'd think he'd turn out a commission maybe for those reasons, and yet he stayed in Japan, and kept.
Well, he did become a warrant officer.
Okay,
that's a warrant officer is, I think, an intermediate step between and commissioned officers. And I don't know how long he stayed in the service.
Yeah, and I haven't been able to find that either. And then from his dad saying he's in Japan in 1955 until he gets married in Vegas in 1970, there's nothing. I can't find anything. Yeah, it's strange. So one thing that while you were in the other room, JJ and I were conspiring.
Oh, yeah.
No, we were just talking. And one of the things JJ wanted to kind of get back to was asking you how you got into history and how do you, I guess, land every military history nerd's dream job. Like, how do you get that gig?
It was accidental.
Okay.
I was a history major in college as an undergraduate. I loved history in general. I went to college on an ROTC scholarship, which people could still get. And I would encourage young people, if you're interested in serving your country, take a look at that. Get a college degree, and you commission as an officer. I did 4 years active duty, and I decided that I did not want to make a career of being an Army officer. So I thought, well, I'll be a college professor. So I went to graduate school and eventually got my PhD in European history. I knew nothing about California. I knew nothing about the Japanese-American experience. And then I was working in a one-year position on the West Coast at a college. And I saw a job announcement for a historian position, a government job at the Defense Language Institute. So I applied and jumped into it. And honestly, a few months into the job, a short Japanese American man walked into my office. Shig Kihara was one of the original 4 instructors.
Mhm.
He had made a career at the Defense Language Institute and had retired 10 or 20 years before, but was a real advocate for the MIS history.
Mhm.
And looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're a historian, right?" I said, "Yeah, I'm the new historian." He said, "Well, then you have to learn and you have to write about the history of the MIS." So I attribute it to Shig Kihara, who turned me on to the story and introduced me to a bunch of guys. First in Northern California, and then in Southern California, there were MIS clubs.
Mm.
Yeah, the post-war story is interesting too, because I discovered that, like, the American Legion set up separate posts. There were Japanese American Legion posts in Seattle and San Francisco and in Honolulu and I think in Los Angeles. Sometimes down the street from each other. So interesting. The post-war experience I find really interesting. So yeah, that's how I got into it, and I had to learn fast because I didn't know my Japanese American history, let alone Japanese history, and and just got to work on it. And the more I dug, the more just interested I became, because it's a fascinating story, and it changed my way of looking at World War II.
Mm.
When I broke it down, it wasn't just one big battle. It was a series of engagements, and it required all kinds of soldiers' skills and courage, and frankly, different kinds of courage in different situations. And it's happening today. There still is language training going on, the Defense Language Institute, and they're training young American men and women from all the armed services in a wide variety of languages. And Arabic was really hot for the last 20 years. Still teaching some Persian, Farsi, you can imagine, Korean. Pretty much all the hot spots around the world. The Defense Language Institute is training soldiers to this day, and a lot of what they're doing is quite similar to the Nisei were doing in World War II.
Yeah.
Translating documents. Now, of course, it may be monitoring someone's social media, translating or listening in on radio communications. And occasionally doing some interpreting.
Yeah. So something you said about the post-war kind of, veterans communities and life reminded me of something I had in my notes about during the war. Could you tell us a little bit about the Hood River incident?
Oh yeah, that's really important. Let me think for a second.
No, I totally understand. It's a pivot way back in the story. So
yeah. That was Frank Hachia, who was also in the 7th Infantry Division language team. This was on Leyte, I believe, December or January of 44, 45. He was scheduled to go on leave back to Hawaii. And his headquarters got a phone call, "Hey, we got a prisoner. And need to have a linguist come out and help us interrogate the prisoner." Well, the guy who was supposed to do it was sick that day. And so Frank, who was from Hood River, Oregon, said, "No, I'll go. So he went, and something went wrong. He was shot in the abdomen, probably by a Japanese soldier hiding nearby. He survived for a few hours or a day or so, I think, and then passed away. So he awarded the Purple Heart and the Silver Star for his bravery. Meanwhile, at virtually the same time, the American Legion post in Hood River took umbrage at a large signboard that listed all the young men who had enlisted in the Army from Hood River. And the American Legion was notorious back then. Obviously, I'm not talking about today's American Legion, but back in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, they were very conservative, and in some ways they were racist. I'll be honest. And so they had demanded that the county remove the Japanese names. I think there were 16 Japanese Americans who had enlisted in the armed forces. Their names were stricken from this big public signboard of the young men. Well, the news that Frank Hachiya had been killed on Lady arrived just as this incident blew up in the press about taking names off. And I must say the American Legion National Headquarters objected and made them reverse it. So, good. But the local initially was very anti-Japanese. And so these two stories hit the national press at the same time. There were stories in the Washington Post and the New York Times about this, which were really a disgrace to the American Legion, to the local American Legion Post. The liberal Americans were just appalled at this evidence of, the racist taint in that part of the world. Ironically, Frank Hachiya, though he was from Hood River, his name was not on that sign because they took a list of soldiers who had enlisted from Hood River. He was at the University of Washington, I think, at the time, and he enlisted in Seattle. So he wasn't officially on the roster. But anyway, it was a way of exposing the lingering racism among conservative white folks on the West Coast. Which, as the camps closed down and as many of the Issei and Nisei came back from the camps to try to go back to their homes, their towns, their farms, many of them faced sometimes vigilante violence and threats by some Americans that just didn't want them back again.
Yeah. So something that I noticed in your book was talking about some of the young men who'd served, MIS Nisei, who'd served in the Pacific, not wanting to extend, not wanting to take commissions, partially to come home as they knew their families were going to be leaving camps and going back to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I've also seen there's a person that I think we're going to profile in a future series of on Sumo, but he had a family with young children and they were in a camp. And his wife and kids stayed in the camp. He left. He went back to Fresno and kind of got the lay of the land before kind of saying, okay, it's safe to come back. But that was a very uncertain thing and very different from community to community and family to family.
Yeah, the Western Defense Command did not allow any person of Japanese origin back to the West Coast until sometime in the fall of 1944. And the Supreme Court began ruling some of the cases about the exclusion order in very late 1944. And the Roosevelt administration announced they were going to close the camps in December of 44. So before the end of the war, actually. But you're exactly right. There were a number of soldiers, Japanese American soldiers, in Europe with the 442, as well as the MIS in the Pacific, who were concerned that their parents were going to need help coming out of the camp. So they were in a hurry to get home and help their mom and dad.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating story, guys. I'd like to wrap it up pretty soon. It's getting late here on the East Coast.
No. I think that those were our last little. No, I appreciate it.
You really got me going, and I'm really interested in the topic.
And we are too.
And so, hey, how many episodes are you planning on?
Ooh, boy.
I think we have right at 10, not counting interviews.
Wow.
We have that planned, and then from there, if we decide to hit Hawaii, it's going to go crazy.
Yeah. So I think we're kind of, this series is kind of focused on California, plus kind of laying the general groundwork. Yeah. And then in future series, I think we're going to expand to Hawaii a bit more and focus on Northern California, the Pacific Northwest. And I think one thing that you really hinted at that I want to find out more about is what happened kind of in the camps and after, as Japanese communities spread to Chicago and the Twin Cities and came back to the West Coast. And why did sumo die out, right? Like, why did sumo die out, especially on the West Coast, and not really revive until the 90s? And even then, very small. Whereas, like judo survived. Like, what was kind of the difference there? And we'll talk judo for you, JJ.
Well,
but
like the baseball leagues, there was a Japanese American baseball league before the war. I never heard that came back after the war. Maybe it did. I don't know.
Yeah. And so, those stories of kind of, because I think one of the narratives I've heard that I personally find is kind of insidious about the whole removal and incarceration is somebody said, it was helping to preserve the Japanese communities, that it was preserving, right? And just looking at some of these cultural things like sumo or these leagues, like these devastated communities and scattered people all over the world and the country. And there were all these rich parts of cultural life that just died after the war.
Yeah.
And they're just symptoms of a much larger kind of disruption to life. And you can preserve people, but that's not preserving kind of a culture, an identity, communities.
And people should have a choice. You shouldn't do it by force. I think Roosevelt early on, made some comment that maybe it's better if we just disperse this population across the country. He should not have the power to do that.
No.
If you have some leader that comes along and says, I'm going to take this group of people and pick them up and move them over here, be really careful, because that's not the way the world should work, in my opinion. I don't want to get political, but this was, Stalin was doing that. Stalin was doing that in the Soviet Union with terrible, terrible consequences for the people involved, not to mention other dictators on the continent at the time. So communities naturally evolve, people migrate, they move from one side of the country to the other, or they cluster together in one country, and there's a certain natural process. But be very suspicious of a government leader who decides he's going to start molding the population in a certain way. It's not the country I want to live in.
Well, and just so you know, our first conversations we had, JJ, Jake, and I, who are the main people running this, like first thing I had on the agenda when we're like, guys, it's going to get political really quickly. Are we all okay with that? Well, and we're like, all of us said, yeah. It's going to go there. It's inevitably, and the forced placement of an entire group of people based on race in concentration camps shouldn't be controversial.
Exactly.
Right.
It shouldn't be.
Right.
And with that, I think this is a good spot to end the episode. You can get some rest. You're on the East Coast.
Thank you so much.
And I just want to say the past is important, everyone. Every time that we think, oh, this has never happened before, we'll turn back and it already has happened. So let's just remember, dive into the past so that we're not going to repeat it.
All right. Well said. Thank you, JJ.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Nathan. Good night from the East Coast.
Bye.
Ha